My friends, there is a truth that we often forget when life weighs heavy upon us, a truth that should bring comfort, hope, and strength to every weary soul listening today. And it is this: God knows your weakness. He sees every struggle, every fear, every moment when you feel like you cannot go on. But He does not look at your weakness with disappointment. He looks at you with love. He sees not just who you are, but who you can become in His strength. So many people live under the weight of their own insufficiencies. They say, I am not strong enough. I am not wise enough. I am not brave enough. And yet throughout Scripture we see that God never called the strong. He strengthened the called. He never chose the most qualified. He qualified those He chose. Moses stood before God and said, I can't speak well. Gideon cried out, I am the least in my family. Peter denied knowing Christ out of fear, but God took their weaknesses and turned them into testimonies of His power. You see, weakness is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of God's power at work in you. It is in those moments when you say, Lord, I can't do this, that He replies, my child, I never asked you to do it alone. His strength is made perfect in weakness. That means when you feel like you have nothing left to give, He is ready to fill you with more than you could ever imagine. Think about the challenges you face today, the obstacles that seem insurmountable, the burdens that feel too heavy to carry. Now think about what it would mean to place them in the hands of the Almighty. What would change in your life? If you truly believe that God is not limited by your limitations, that He does not see your weakness as a hindrance, but as an opportunity to show His power, it's time to stop focusing on what you lack and start trusting in what He provides. He is the God who strengthens the weary, who lifts up the brokenhearted, who gives courage to those who are afraid. And today He is calling you to stop relying on your own strength and start depending on His. Because when you do, you will find that His strength is always enough. There is a powerful truth that many people struggle to grasp, and it is this: God knows everything about you. He sees the depths of your heart, the battles you fight, and the burdens you carry. He is not unaware of the moments when fear grips you, when doubt creeps in, or when you feel too weak to move forward. He knows when you feel unqualified, uncertain, and unable to handle what life has placed in front of you. But here's what you need to understand: God does not see your weakness as a flaw. He sees it as a place where His power can be revealed. From the very beginning, humanity has wrestled with weakness. Adam and Eve hid in shame, knowing they had failed. Moses trembled at the thought of speaking before Pharaoh. David, though called a man after God's own heart, had moments of deep failure and despair. Peter, despite his boldness, denied even knowing Jesus when fear overtook him. These were not perfect people. They were flawed, broken, and weak in their own strength. But God did not abandon them because of their weaknesses. Instead, He stepped in with grace, strength, and power, showing them that He is greater than their limitations. God is not surprised by your struggles. He is not taken aback by the moments when you feel overwhelmed or incapable. He knows when you try to hide your fears behind a strong exterior. He knows when you feel inadequate in your calling, unworthy of His love, or incapable of carrying the burdens placed upon you. Yet, in all of this, He does not look at you with disappointment. He looks at you with deep love and understanding. Consider the way a loving parent looks at their child. When a child stumbles while learning to walk, the parent does not become angry or frustrated. They do not see the child as a failure. Instead, they see the potential, the progress, the effort. They reach down with open arms, ready to lift their child up again. This is how God looks at you. He does not focus on your failures. He focuses on what He is doing in your life. The enemy wants you to believe that your weaknesses disqualify you. He wants you to think that because you struggle, you are unworthy of God's calling and love. He whispers lies that make you doubt your place in God's plan. But the truth is the exact opposite. Your weakness is not a reason for God to abandon you. It is the very reason He wants to work in you. If you were already strong on your own, you wouldn't need Him. But because you are weak, His strength can be made known. There is nothing in your life that God does not already know. He sees the burdens you carry, the prayers you pray in silence, and the nights when tears fall because you feel overwhelmed. He understands the insecurities you try to hide and the fears that threaten to paralyze you. But He does not leave you to struggle alone. He is there, offering His strength, His guidance, and His peace. It is easy to compare yourself to others and believe that you are not as strong, not as capable, not as worthy, but God never called you to be strong in your own power. He never asked you to carry everything on your own. He simply asked you to trust Him, to bring your weakness to Him, and to allow Him to be your strength. If you feel like you are not enough, you are exactly where God can work. If you feel like your past, your failures, or your fears hold you back, remember that God is not looking for perfect people. He is looking for willing hearts. He does not need your strength. He needs your surrender. When you bring your weakness to Him, He can do far more than you ever imagined. God knows every part of you, including the parts you wish were different. But instead of seeing weakness as something to be ashamed of, see it as an invitation to rely on Him more fully. Because when you do, you will find that His strength is always greater than your weakness. All throughout history, God has chosen people who by human standards did not seem qualified for the task ahead of them. He did not seek out the strongest, the most confident, or those with the most experience. Instead, He chose the weak, the fearful, and the ones who felt completely incapable. He did this to show that His power, not human ability, is what brings about true victory. Look at Moses, a man who doubted his ability to speak. When God called him to lead His people out of Egypt, Moses immediately pointed to his weakness, saying he was slow of speech. He saw his own limitations and believed they would prevent him from fulfilling God's plan. But God did not see Moses' weakness as an obstacle. Instead, He provided everything Moses needed, signs, miracles, and even Aaron as a spokesperson to accomplish His purpose. It was never about what Moses could do. It was always about what God would do through him. Then there was Gideon, a man hiding in fear when God called him a mighty warrior. Gideon saw himself as the least in his family, coming from the weakest tribe. By human standards, he was not a leader. But God did not choose him for his strength. He chose him so that His own power would be revealed. With just 300 men, Gideon defeated an army far greater in number. The victory was not because of military might, but because of God's divine intervention. David was just a shepherd boy when he was anointed as the future king of Israel. He had no royal lineage, no experience in battle, nothing that made him stand out among his brothers. When he faced Goliath, he did not rely on his own strength, but on the power of God. With a simple sling and 5 stones, he defeated a giant that an entire army feared. God took someone who seemed insignificant and used him to accomplish something extraordinary. Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, was impulsive and often let his emotions guide him. He walked on water for a moment, but quickly began to sink when doubt crept in. He boldly proclaimed that he would never abandon Jesus, yet he denied Him 3 times when fear took hold. But Jesus did not cast Peter aside because of his failures. Instead, He restored him and used him to build His church. Peter preached on the day of Pentecost, and thousands came to faith because of the power of God working through him. The pattern is clear. God does not call the qualified, He qualifies the called. He does not look for those who have it all together. He looks for those who are willing to trust Him despite their weaknesses. He takes what the world sees as insignificant and uses it for His glory. This is why no one can ever say they are too weak, too unworthy, or too broken to be used by God. It is never about human strength. It is about divine power. When God calls someone, He does not leave them to figure it out on their own. He provides wisdom when they feel lost. He gives courage when fear threatens to hold them back. He strengthens them when they feel too weak to continue. He is the one who equips, empowers, and enables His people to accomplish what they never thought possible. So many people believe that their past mistakes disqualify them. They think that because they have failed before, they cannot be used by God. But the very opposite is true. God often uses those who have experienced the deepest struggles because they understand His grace in a way that others do not. Their weakness becomes a testimony of His strength. No one is beyond God's ability to use. No weakness is too great for Him to overcome. If He could use Moses, Gideon, David, and Peter, flawed, fearful, and weak individuals, then he can use anyone who is willing to trust him. It is not about what you can do. It is about what he can do through you. Weakness is something that most people try to hide. It is uncomfortable, it feels like failure, and it often brings shame. The world teaches that strength is what matters, that only the powerful succeed, and that showing any sign of weakness is a sign of defeat. But God's perspective is completely different. He does not see weakness as something to be ashamed of. He sees it as an opportunity for his power to be revealed. Time and time again, Scripture shows that human weakness is the perfect setting for divine strength. When Paul pleaded with God to remove the thorn in his flesh, God's answer was not to take it away, but to remind Paul of a deeper truth. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Instead of viewing his weakness as a hindrance, Paul began to see it as the very thing that allowed God's power to shine through him. He declared, when I am weak, then I am strong. This is a truth that goes against everything the world teaches. Most people believe that strength comes from self-reliance, from pushing through challenges on their own, from proving that they have what it takes. But the strength that truly matters does not come from within. It comes from above. It is in the moments when human ability is not enough that God steps in and shows what he can do. When people come to the end of their own strength, that is when they are finally ready to receive his. Consider the story of the Israelites at the Red Sea, trapped between Pharaoh's army and the vast waters ahead. They had no way out. Their weakness was undeniable. They had no weapons, no plan, no possible way of saving themselves. But that moment of helplessness became the stage for one of the greatest displays of God's power. With a mighty hand, he parted the sea, making a way where there was none. If the Israelites had been strong enough to save themselves, they would not have seen the miracle. But because they were weak, God's power was revealed. This is a truth that goes against everything the world teaches. Most people believe that strength comes from self-reliance, from pushing through challenges on their own, from proving that they have what it takes. But the strength that truly matters does not come from within. It comes from above. It is in the moments when human ability is not enough that God steps in and shows what he can do. When people come to the end of their own strength, that is when they are finally ready to receive his. Consider the story of the Israelites at the Red Sea. Trapped between Pharaoh's army and the vast waters ahead, they had no way out. Their weakness was undeniable. They had no weapons, no plan, no possible way of saving themselves. But that moment of helplessness became the stage for one of the greatest displays of God's power. With a mighty hand, he parted the sea, making a way where there was none. If the Israelites had been strong enough to save themselves, they would not have seen the miracle. But because they were weak, God's power was revealed. Think of Elijah, a prophet who stood boldly against the prophets of Baal, yet found himself running in fear, exhausted and discouraged. He reached a breaking point and cried out to God, believing he was alone and unable to continue. But in that moment of deep weakness, God met him, not in a great wind or an earthquake, but in a gentle whisper. He strengthened Elijah, renewed his calling, and reminded him that he was never alone. Even Jesus, the Son of God, demonstrated this principle when he came to earth. He did not arrive as a mighty king with an army, but as a humble servant. He chose the path of weakness in the eyes of the world, born in a manger, walking among the poor, submitting to suffering and even death on a cross. But through what seemed like weakness, the greatest victory was won. The power of God was fully displayed in the resurrection, proving that his strength is greater than any human weakness. Every person faces moments when they feel unqualified, unable, or overwhelmed. The natural response is to shrink back, to let fear take over, or to believe that they are not good enough. But those moments are actually an invitation to rely on God in a way they never have before. Instead of asking, how can I overcome this, the real question should be, how can God show his power through this? Because when weakness is surrendered to him, it becomes the very thing that brings forth his strength. No one enjoys feeling weak, but weakness is never the end of the story when God is involved. When a person acknowledges their limitations and stops relying on their own strength, that is when God's power can work most effectively. What seems impossible becomes possible. What seems like failure turns into testimony. What seems like an obstacle becomes an opportunity to experience God in a deeper way. The world may see weakness as something to avoid, but God sees it as the perfect place for His strength to be revealed. So many people go through life believing that they must rely on their own strength to succeed. They carry burdens too heavy to bear, try to fix problems beyond their ability, and face challenges that seem impossible to overcome. They believe they have to be strong enough, wise enough, and capable enough on their own. But the truth is, no one was ever meant to walk through life alone, carrying the weight of their struggles without help. God never intended for people to rely on their own strength. He calls them to trust in His. Throughout Scripture, there's a consistent message. Human strength will always fail, but God's strength never will. When people trust in themselves, they eventually reach their limits. Their energy runs out, their wisdom falls short, and their efforts prove insufficient. But those who place their trust in God find a source of strength that never runs dry. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us that those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The key is not striving harder, but surrendering more. One of the greatest examples of trusting in God's strength rather than one's own is found in the story of Jehoshaphat. Faced with an enemy army far greater than his own, he did something unexpected. He did not gather more weapons, train more soldiers, or try to develop a battle strategy. Instead, he called the people to fast and pray. He acknowledged before God that they were powerless on their own and that their only hope was in Him. And because he chose to trust in God's strength rather than his own, the battle was won without them even lifting a sword. God fought for them. That is what God does when people surrender their weakness to Him. He steps in and does what they could never do on their own. Yet so many hesitate to fully trust Him. They believe in God, but still try to control their circumstances. They say they have faith, yet they continue to carry burdens they were never meant to bear. True trust means letting go, acknowledging that only God has the strength to handle what seems impossible. Peter experienced this firsthand when he walked on water. As long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus, he did what no human should have been able to do. He defied the natural laws of the world because his trust was in the one who had power over the storm. But the moment he shifted his focus, the moment he began to rely on himself, he started to sink. That is what happens when people depend on their own strength. They begin to sink under the weight of fear, doubt, and worry. But Jesus was there to lift Peter up, just as He is always there to lift up those who trust in Him. There is a freedom that comes with surrendering to God's strength. The weight of trying to be enough is lifted. The pressure to figure everything out disappears. The fear of failure loses its grip. Because when a person truly trusts in God, they no longer have to rely on their own ability. They know that He is in control, that His power is greater than any challenge, and that His strength is always available to them. It does not mean that life will be without trials, but it does mean that no trial will ever be faced alone. It means that when strength fails, His strength will carry them. It means that when fear rises, His peace will calm it. It means that when the path ahead seems uncertain, His guidance will make it clear. Trusting in God's strength does not remove the storms of life, but it ensures that no storm will ever be stronger than the one who holds His people in His hands. The greatest victories do not come from human effort, but from divine power. Those who choose to trust in themselves will always reach a breaking point, but those who choose to trust in God will find a strength that never runs out, a power that never fails, and a presence that never leaves. The more a person lets go of their own need for control, the more they will experience the incredible strength of God working in their lives. There are moments in life when weakness feels overwhelming, the burdens seem too heavy, the obstacles too great, and the path too uncertain. It is in these moments that doubt creeps in, whispering that strength is not enough, that the challenge is too big, that there is no way forward. But what many fail to realize is that God's strength is never limited. It does not waver, it does not diminish, and it is never out of reach. No matter how weak a person may feel, God's strength is always enough. The world teaches that people must push through on their own, that they must be strong at all times, and that asking for help is a sign of failure. But that is not how God works. His strength is not given to those who try to prove they are capable on their own. It is given to those who acknowledge that they need Him. He does not demand perfection. He invites surrender. He does not require human strength. He offers His own. When Paul struggled with a weakness that he wished would go away, he pleaded with God to remove it. But instead of taking it away, God gave him a greater truth. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul came to understand that his own strength was not the answer. God's strength was. Rather than feeling defeated by his weakness, he embraced it because he knew that God's power would be displayed through it. What seemed like a limitation became an opportunity for God's strength to be revealed. This is the truth that so many need to grasp. Weakness is not a barrier to God's power. It is the very thing that allows His power to be seen. Those who feel like they have nothing left to give are exactly where they need to be, because that is where God can work most mightily. Those who feel like they are at their breaking point are the ones who will see His strength carry them through. Consider the disciples when they faced the storm on the Sea of Galilee. They had been on the water many times before, but this storm was beyond their ability to control. Fear took hold, and they thought they would perish. But when Jesus spoke, the wind and waves obeyed. What they could not do in their own strength, He accomplished with a single command. That is the power of God. He steps into the storms of life and brings peace, showing that His strength is greater than any fear, any trial, or any weakness. David understood this when he faced Goliath. By all human reasoning, he should have lost. He was just a shepherd boy with a sling and 5 stones facing a giant with years of battle experience. But David did not rely on his own ability. He relied on God's strength. While others saw an impossible battle, David saw an opportunity for God to display His power. He knew that the battle was not his to fight alone, and because of that trust, he walked away victorious. The same is true for anyone who puts their trust in God's strength. No situation is too overwhelming, no battle is too difficult, and no weakness is too great for Him to overcome. When a person acknowledges that their own strength is not enough, that is when they experience the fullness of His power. It does not matter how tired, afraid, or weak they feel. What matters is that God's strength is more than enough. Faith is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting the one who does. It is about knowing that no matter how weak a person may feel, God is always strong. It is about resting in the truth that His power will sustain, His grace will provide, and His presence will never leave. The more a person depends on Him, the more they will see His strength carrying them through. Every struggle, every hardship, and every moment of weakness is an opportunity to experience the unfailing strength of God. His strength is not temporary. It is not limited. It is not only for certain people. It is available to all who call upon Him. Those who trust in their own strength will eventually fall, but those who trust in the Lord will find that His strength never fails. He is more than enough for every challenge, every trial, and every moment of weakness. No one is too weak for God to use. No struggle is too great for Him to overcome. No failure is beyond His power to redeem. The very things that make a person feel inadequate are the things that invite His strength to work in their lives. Time and time again, He has shown that He does not choose the strongest, the most capable, or the most qualified. He chooses those who are willing to trust in Him. God knows every weakness, every fear, and every doubt. He sees the struggles that seem impossible to overcome, but He does not call people to rely on their own strength. He calls them to rely on His. His power is made perfect in weakness. His grace is always enough. His strength is never failing. So do not shrink back in fear. Do not let weakness define the future. Do not believe the lie that you are not enough. Because when God is with you, you are never alone. When His strength is in you, you are never powerless. And when you place your trust in Him, there is no battle He cannot win, no burden He cannot carry, and no weakness He cannot turn into strength.